and welcome to this episode of People Are Animals Too, Darn It. I'm your host, Mandy Evans, and today my guest is Ed Jamison. He is the Director of Dallas Animal Services. Welcome, Ed.
Hi, Mandy. Thank you so much for having me.
You are welcome. I'm thrilled that we were able to secure a time. I know you're a very busy man. And what we wanted to talk about today is that you run one of the largest municipal shelters in the country and get some questions answered around how billing is handled and how all of this stuff around municipal shelters is really changing because of COVID and just some advancement in animal welfare. But before we go there, I was hoping that you could tell us a little bit about yourself and about your shelter.
Yeah, thanks. Like you said, I am the director for Dallas Animal Services. Before COVID hit and hiring freezes and whatnot, we had about 220 staff. In last fiscal year, we had an intake of dog and cats of over 39,000 dogs and cats, which has us have to be extremely creative in handling that type of volume all out of one impound center in the entire city. Prior to coming to Dallas, I came to Dallas in October of 2017, so I'm not quite at 3 years yet, but I was the chief animal control officer for the city of Cleveland, which most cities deal with very similar type issues, but Dallas has definitely has some challenges that probably most in the country don't have, but nonetheless, we awesome, amazing team. We take those challenges head on, and we really take a one day at a time while strategically planning for the future.
So you are then responsible for not only the animals that come into the shelter, but you also have an animal control team that's out in the field.
Correct. Our department is broken down, and I should say that we became a standalone department just before I got here also, in October 1st of 2017, as we were under code compliance before, and that was one of the things when they decided to really reinvest in the animal services and try to get answers to some of the problems. So within my department, like I said, about 220 positions. There's 4 divisions. There's our field services division, there's our medical division, our shelter division, and then our admin division. So it's 4 divisions within the department.
Okay. And your medical division, does it primarily do spay and neuter? Does it treat community animals that are at risk? How does the medical division work?
Medical is huge, and especially when you get into our life-saving, and people who've looked at our data and see the huge jump in 2017, 18, really, we invested first on the medical was a huge component because there were animals that weren't leaving. In Texas, shelter veterinarians are not allowed to work on owned pets. So that puts up some major barriers. And I had issues even with getting our foster program up and going. Animals after they left and were adopted, we ramped up adoptions tremendously, but then not having aftercare for them unless they were rebooked back into the system. And that's a Texas law that certainly causes some challenges, but my medical team has been terrific. They all have the mindset of trying to save animals. So we find ways to work within that scope to make sure that they're not violating anything from the state code, but it certainly is a challenge. But spay neuters, I believe we did 13,000-ish in-house last year, in-house. And there's some private efforts, particularly in the underserved areas of Dallas, that did another 13-ish thousand surgeries, and that was just for half the city that they were targeting. So there's a lot of spay neuters surgeries getting done, but we do everything. One of the ways when you're looking at life-saving is you have to be honest and really look at what's not leaving and why. Everything was bunched into medical and behavior. You can't learn from that at all. So we got really honest, transparent, and really detailed level. All right, what kind of behavior? Just scared in the shelter? Okay, play group helps that, right off the bat. Those animals, that wasn't a reason that they would be marked for euthanasia. But the medical was so broad that we had to really dial in, and we had to get a lot more categories to what does medical mean? And we really do try to treat everything we can. We saw dogs were 35% more likely to be euthanized if they were heartworm positive. Well, like half the dogs in Texas are heartworm positive. And if that puts them at 35% more risk, so we developed a program around heartworm. which does take resources, but we will treat any animal in our shelter for heartworm. And that took a lot of hurdles to work through, again, with that owned animal scenario that we have with veterinary law, but we were able to find ways to do that. And not everybody takes advantage of it. Some still want to go to their private vet, but that is something that it's pretty cool seeing in the morning when animals are coming back, and I'll say, hey, are you here for an appointment or what? And they're like, yeah, we adopted Scruffy and he's getting his second heartworm treatment today. And it's pretty cool hearing people's stories, that knowing that those animals are, one, able to find a positive outcome, and then two, still be able to be treated.
So listening to you, I find it very inspirational, because I am talking to shelters that have municipal contracts, and they really struggle with trying to convince the higher ups that providing medical is something that is important. It seems that the conversation a lot of the time is all about intake. Like, our job is to keep animals off the street. They come in. If they don't leave, they're euthanized. And even though in animal welfare we have this movement of increasing live releases and being more proactive, so really we have to have this discussion of how do we help shelters that are working within their municipal contracts or the municipality in convincing this leadership that having a more preventative mindset helps in the end. Do you have advice for shelters when it comes to that?
Yeah, it's tough. And even Dallas, it really was started with loose dogs. You may or may not have heard of the Boston Consulting Firm study that was done in 2017 in Dallas. And that was commissioned after Antoinette Brown was mauled by a pack of dogs that had repeat reports of causing problems in the neighborhood. And it is one of the most thorough studies I've ever seen in many industries. And they literally were out counting loose dogs throughout the city for a period of time. And then they did a bunch of peer city studies on staffing. And so there was a big talk. I was hired to help solve the loose dog crisis in Dallas. But at the same time, I was mandated to increase live outcomes as well. So it's like, those don't usually run on a parallel track. That we're actually going to impound more. And so the city did put its money where its mouth is and invested more, not just in field services. They did invest in field services, but they also invested in shelter, medical, and the admin is a huge forgotten component in many animal shelters. That all that behind the scenes stuff, sending out notices and all of that, paying bills on time, that people even want to deal with the municipality. You've got to pay your bills quickly or no one's going to want to be a vendor. So it all really ties together, that if you're going to be upping things on field activities, you also have to think about the ripple effect of, if those animals are coming to the shelter, what type of impact. And it doesn't do you any good to not increase the shelter or medical. You're going to have sickness all over the place because you can't even get vaccines in timely as they enter the building. And if you're anywhere in the South, distemper and parvo are both things that are just daily. We see almost daily during certain times of the year. But yeah, many municipalities just look at the intake portion alone. And if they don't look at the whole picture, it's going to be very hard to life save if there's not resources. Dallas was very real about it, that you have to put resources in, and anything that you do, you have to manage those resources once you're given them. And that's one of the reasons that we try to record anything and everything we're doing. So even in this very difficult budget time, because of COVID crisis that every municipality is going to have across the country, we're able to say this service, or right down to this person, equals this much live release rate, this much securing of loose dogs, this much towards RTO. We're able to actually assign a number based on data. And that's my number one advice, is that everybody loves a fluffy story. I love a fluffy story. We all love fluffy stories. They're great. They make us feel good, but they're not it's not necessarily data driven on when you're just dealing with the fluff of it. So sometimes even talk about the bad if you're trying to develop a plan for something that you're not succeeding in. You have to have data behind it. Everyone can say we want people to be safe in the public, but we also want live outcomes. There's so much in between there that just another example was looking at animals dying. We looked at neonatal kittens were for the most part put down on intake, especially if they came in after hours. And gosh, it was 2,200 neonatal kittens the year before. And none of this is knocking anybody who was there before me. If you don't have the resources, you can't put a 2-day-old kitten in a cage without having been able to bottle feed it. So we were able to come up with and justify a bottle feeding neonatal program that saves thousands of kittens' lives now. But you never would get that. Those were all just in a medical category before. So having the numbers to really talk to the decision makers and the people that control the money to be able to say, this is going to equal 2,200 kittens, either put down the second they come into the building or give them a fighting chance to find a live outcome for them.
So it's interesting, and I hope that you don't find this offensive, but when like before, when I would think of Dallas, I would think of overrun with animals. Like the need is so high that high euthanasia rate, though I don't even know for a fact that that would be true. That's just my mindset. What do you do when the need is so high? You're like, you become a factory almost, like turn and burn and get things done. And so listening to you, I'm moved and impressed with so much care and time. And, the fact that what we have seen in our own area is that it's hard to get the municipalities to even understand the life value of an animal. So like your neonatals and the amount of care you're putting in, I know for us, that would be a really hard sell because they're so money driven. So how did you, was there outside pressure to be able to increase live release? Like how did the emphasis on animal well-being be so brought to the forefront in the minds of people who are dictating the budget?
And very fortunate that, again, in those parallel tracks where they were talking about securing these loose dogs, securing these loose dogs, securing these loose dogs, they did keep saying live outcomes. And it's slightly down. It's the public safety is always going to be number one in Dallas, but it's just below that was the live outcomes. So when they did the budget, it was basically planned out over 3 years. Yes, they beefed up field, then they beefed up shelter, and then they kind of right-sized and beefed up wherever needed on that third year of the plan to allocate resources to it. And it is, especially looking at where we're at right now. There are some who will say, okay, you can't save every kitten. Okay, you can't save everything, but you can try. And I've always had the mind thought of I will try to save everything that I can responsibly save. And yes, people they're lying in the sand as to what's responsibly between dangerous that I may feel one way and somebody else might, or medical that look, this animal's suffering in our care, we can't alleviate the suffering. And I can deal with that there's a line. Everybody has to have a line at some point, but luckily the policymakers of Dallas, it was so important and the situation was so bad, they knew they had to do something. That whether it was truly out of a love for animals or they wanted their constituents to be able to walk to the mailbox without carrying a baseball bat for fear of being accosted by loose dogs. There's a lot of motivations that fell in there. Nobody wanted the dogs running things. And for the people of the community, it's 1.3 million people in Dallas. So they really did have to commit to it. And that's hard, especially in budget crunches like we have now. So we just try to tell the story. We tell it with data. So it's not just made up. And don't get me wrong, we do tons of fuzzy Facebook posts and everything too. But we very much so report the numbers. These are the numbers. There's no making that up. And I think our budget season is just kicking in. August is when it'll get fast and furious here in Dallas, and October 1st starts the new fiscal year. There's going to be a lot of tough decisions on a lot of things, and we had to submit for reductions as well. My hope is that they will see we don't want to go back this far in Dallas Animal Services because there are certain things that it does take money. I can tell you money driven, one of the things that drew me, I was happy in Cleveland. I had no intention of leaving. I still haven't seen the new building that got built there. We were moving and grooving, but a couple of things caught my eye in Dallas, and it was one, Dallas got rid of dog licensing. I'm like, ooh, because I think that's really smart to get rid of dog licensing. And most can't do it. They look at revenue. You really don't make that much revenue after you're done with all the administration, and the compliance rate is so low. So I have more respect for municipalities that say we're doing it for revenue, not for keeping track of dogs, because the compliance rate, super uber animal people like us would have that on our calendar. Ooh, it's time of year I have to get my animal relicensed. Other than that, it's when somebody's dog gets loose and enters the shelter is the only time they're even getting it. So Dallas went to a microchip. You don't even have to call that number in. So it's not a matter of keeping a census on that each year you have to send it in. And our RTO rates jumped up. We were over 30, almost 37% last year, with like 67 return to owners in field. That makes sense. And they can see the value in those animals either not coming into the shelter because they go back an RTO to field, or quickly getting out of the shelter with whatever compliance measures we have to have, which everything has to be altered in Dallas. It has to have the microchip. So those are two huge things. I'm like, man, they're making sense there, and realizing they weren't really making money. Money was coming in on licensing, but almost as much was going out on what it took to actually administer that. So if they're willing to, like we're reimagining animal services in the country, if our powers that be are willing to reimagine it too, I think that there's a chance, because I think there are some things that are actually costing municipalities more money, but they've just kind of been measures that we've used for years. And that's intake alone is one of those things.
Right. I just heard a story recently, and I don't know where the shelter was, but the return to owner fee was like $500. And they couldn't figure out why people weren't coming in and claiming their animals, or that, and the owner surrender fee was really high too. I can't remember, but they had no owner surrenders, and it was all strays. So like, we had this crazy amount of strays coming in. Oh, that's why. So I just had I want to clarify. So the microchip mandate is that they're asking that everyone have their pets microchipped. Is that, and then do you provide that service at the shelter?
So we are able to, and it's low cost at the shelter. If you just come in and need them, I want to say it's $5, maybe it's $10. However, again, another drawing force to Dallas. If you know Dallas at all, it's pretty much, it's a circle for the most part. The city lies within a circle, and Interstate 30 cuts it right in half. South of Interstate 30 is historically underserved, and north of Interstate 30 is not underserved. Most of the wealth is in northern Dallas, and most of the poverty is in southern Dallas. It's really, the more I learn, it is really a line drawn. And so something called the Spay Neuter Surge, Let's Fix This program, targets the 23 zip codes that are all south of 30, and then a couple of little veins that come up over Interstate 30, but they had to do with poverty and income levels. And these services are completely done. It's private money, and it's administered through the SPCA of Texas and Spay Neuter Network, or two private entities. And your animal can get fixed, the microchip, and the rabies completely free if you're in one of those 23 zip codes. And it's been hugely, hugely effective. And again, me looking from the outsider, like, all right, hey, they're getting rid of unnecessary things like licensing. You've got the community working together to really try to fix something, because if you're going to mandate mandatory spay neuter, you had better be able to get the service done, because low cost isn't low cost to everybody. Low cost is extremely high cost for some people, and depending on where their income is, and it doesn't make them bad people or bad pet owners by any means. So to really be targeted like that in those specific zip codes, and normally I don't like target, I like for everybody to be able to, well, I live across the street, I'm not eligible. But the 23 zip codes is a huge area. It's bigger than the city of Atlanta, those 23 zip codes. More people than the city of Atlanta, just for those 23 zip codes. And it's highly, highly effective on getting microchips in. And don't get me wrong, we find animals with microchips and things haven't been updated, but we're really good at tracking down. As long as we got something, it's a starting point that we can try to track down. We take it very serious that as much as they're about securing loose dogs, our officers are just as worried about trying to find their owner and get the animals back. So we got multiple teams that work on return to owner, some in the field, and if the animal does still make it into the shelter, all kinds of processes in place we've got to lead, get this animal home. We don't want to readopt it. That's a total waste. And won't go off on a tangent on diversity, equity, and inclusion. That is such a big topic, and being one of the few directors of color in the country, it's very near and dear to me. But I would rather get that animal back, have all the compliance things, where now have been seen as the resource and not just the punitive, action in it. Those are the type of measurements that I think that governments need to look into. What types of services are being provided? And again, that animal may not have come into the shelter, but because of the animal services, that's the reason it didn't come in the shelter. And when they're being judged just on whatever equals an intake, for different municipalities, it means different things. Does it have to physically come in? Do your animal control officers have to have control of it? Does the animal just have to be secured? But if it only counts if it comes to the shelter, that's not serving a good purpose for anyone. And finding a politician, decision maker that can have that discussion with, that is that alone? You need me to bring it to the shelter? You just put a burden on the resident, you put a burden on the shelter, and everybody, burden on the officer that could be moving off to another call instead of coming back to the shelter to intake, and get vaccines and everything in. It's a hard discussion, but it's a needed discussion, and it's really what COVID has shown us, that those discussions have to happen.
Yeah, and I feel like sometimes we perpetuate our own problems, and that basing it off of intake perpetuates our own problem, because like you said, if the RTO rate is 30%, what happens to the rest of them? So, and you having that great field, getting those animals while they're in the field back home, that right there is huge. Can you imagine if those animals came into your shelter?
Yeah,
that is great. That's great. So the number one thing, and I do think, and Dr. Pisano says this, is that sometimes we kind of put too much emphasis on our emotional need and our emotional story about animals when we're trying to talk to leadership, and that it really should be dictated through data. And I think even sharing stories that, like yours, where you can say, but this is what they're doing in Dallas, and this is what has been really successful, and leaning on each other as a community resource within animal welfare can make a huge, huge impact. And so you even joining me today can help so many shelters that are really struggling. I am a private shelter and I have municipal contracts. And one of the things that I struggle with is exactly what you said, and I don't remember if we were actually recording at that time, was that we forget to value the administrative piece. And that COVID has really brought awareness to me, because for a great while, our shelter was only open for the single purpose of bringing in stray dogs because of our municipal contracts. And I probably exhausted the whole year's amount of funding I get for that within a month of being open. And it's really hard to convince our municipalities that we should be funded at a different level. And at this point, I know they would not fund preventative programs, but you give me hope that we can tie this together. So if you were looking at priorities and what has made the biggest impact, and if a shelter is trying to create a new narrative to share with their leadership, what are the key data points that they should be focusing on?
Again, every place is different, and I always acknowledge that it's, again, coming from Ohio, there's different state laws in Ohio compared to Texas, and so certain things can certainly be barriers that you just can't even handle at a local or a county level. And this is my good friend Scott Giacopo, best friends and NACA president. We talk about response times, and he doesn't like response times for field, but I actually do. And I think that it can certainly play into, are people rushing just to get calls done as opposed to getting them done properly? And so I think there's value on both sides. But again, coming from Dallas, where there wasn't a lot of response, to showing and building the trust that we are going to respond, that we are going to get there. Now, I'll take that a step further, that sometimes the responses in COVID certainly helped bring this to light. We're calling people on certain priority calls before we send an officer to, one, minimize human-to-human contact. We, with our shifts being all over the place now because of COVID and separating out the teams, we don't have the same amount of people out in the field at any given time. But so we can, sometimes talking to the person, you don't even have to send an officer. You can get the resolve by not even physically going out there. However, responding in a timely manner so that you build the trust, I think, is huge. And again, I love, Scott's one of my very, very dear friends, but I think that should at least be looked at in a setting that how long, because if you're not responding to a call for 3 days, how much faith is there even going to be that anybody's going to actually even call you to understand? But that will at least allow you some data. And that's usually something that's easy to record, is what type of calls are coming in. Again, we weren't recording that in Cleveland the way that we dispatched. It was just a phone call and it was put out. There wasn't a formal record and they came from multiple places. So you can actually look at, do you have enough field staff based on call volume? Does that make sense? That if it's just how you feel and everybody's busy, that's, no politician's going to give you more money just on that you feel busy and your officers don't waste time, as opposed to really. And then I also think that for anything we're doing, and we're trying to do an even better job in Dallas, is making sure that the geographical area you're going, I think, is super important. All districts aren't created equal. And I don't care what municipality you're in. We all know there are some areas that are better off and there's some areas that are not as good off financially. And there's not a municipality out there that doesn't use the term equity these days. And that is talking about equal budgets are not the same as equitable budgets. And I think it's really important to capture, again, whether this is a loose dog call, a bite, a service, of whatever, recording really where is it. So whether it's by zip code, again, each municipality can be different, and Dallas is huge. I think that's important to really know where you're going. People thought dogs only bit in South Dallas, and it was one of our most important slides from last year. We loose dog bites is our big thing. Again, if Mandy wants to let her dog bite her every other week, and she gets a stitch on her finger, yes, the rabies quarantine, I'm going to let you home quarantine it because it happened in your house and all of that. But the loose dog bites are what we report, and it's a big deal in Dallas on showing the effect. My officers don't have any control if Mandy's dog bites her every week. We don't have any control over that. Right. We do have some level of control about loose dogs and loose dog bites, and it allows us to adjust how we respond and what we respond to. But City Council was shocked that about 70% of our calls in general are in Southern Dallas. However, it's not 70% of the bites were just in Southern Dallas. And that was that we all would have felt the dog bites in Southern Dallas because that's what makes the news. And there's a lot more in not underserved areas that was our end of the year report last year that we put on a heat map. Like, ooh, there's a lot more in North Dallas than we had realized. So if they just went into dog bites, we would have thought that, just assumed they were in Southern Dallas. Does that make sense on having the areas that you're responding to everything? I think is a lost art that many people are not doing that. And you're throwing a fix into certain areas that might not need fixing, or you might not be putting enough resources in an area that actually do need help if you're looking at it as your whole jurisdiction.
Right, and what you're describing could potentially be a bias, right? Mm-hmm. That is, you don't even know that you have this bias, but you make an assumption that your lower income neighborhood is somehow going to have a more irresponsible set of owners versus your other areas. So it's good to get that data. So I'm writing notes for myself, by the way. I know I can just re-listen to this, but I love that. I think it's really great because it is so much of the time our gut feeling that we make, and we make some pretty big decisions off of our gut.
I
mean, even I'm trying to think, something happened recently that, there was somebody who came into a hoarding case, and they had learned that this hoarding case owner was collecting dog food from their food bank. And then because of that one case, they were going to mandate that everyone that used the food bank had to go through some hurdles to get food. And it's like, okay, let's all take a breath and say, we get that, but that is definitely an emotional decision. It's not necessarily a logical one. And they're really super great, and they acknowledge that, and they didn't make any changes. But I think in animal welfare, we do that a lot.
Yeah. Yeah. I had a friend from a southern state call me over the weekend, and they had a dog bite incident inside the building, and they're looking to make these really crazy restrictions on. It's like, does this happen every day? Or no, this like next to never happens. And there was a mistake, a human mistake, but we're now going to make everybody sign a waiver to walk in the building. Well, you're going to have a lot of people just not show up, that are not going to want to go through that. And you can't make decisions on the one. It has to be on the numbers. That if your policy is going to be on 1% of things, that's just not really good management of your resources. Here's a resource thing that I think you'll appreciate. So like most shelters, we had a lost and found board, and pictures, lost animals, and they made everybody feel good. And, oh, look, he got found. And the amount of time it took to put into that board made everybody feel good, but that didn't get animals back. It absolutely did not get animals back. Us immediately sending a mailed letter to the possible owned, if we have an address that we believe that's where it lived. Officers hang flyers at the 2 nearest telephone poles when they impound an animal. Be amazed at the conversations that even just come up over that. What are you doing? They're like, oh, that's Mrs. Smith's dog down the street. The process is I shortened hold times last year. I took in 2018, I took a beating when I was, oh, he just wants to kill stuff faster. No, I don't. I've actually got data that if they don't get claimed in the first 3 days, it just drops off the percentage. So why are we going to add 7 more days on for like 4% of the animals that actually get claimed in that period? We're going to hold on to them, running out of space because we're holding on to them for so long. But it took data and for Dallas to trust me on that. We're using data to come up with why we need to shorten it. Here's what we're doing on the process. There's no reclaim fees if you come on the first full day the animal's there. It actually encourages people to be able to come in sooner. Some will say, oh, I got 3 days or whatever. No, there's no fees as long as you come on the first full day. So you pick up Thursday at 3, all of Friday, as long as you come by on a Friday, there's no fees to claim the animal. And that was like a big deal, showing, look, our goal is to get the animal back. But until we dug into the numbers, it was just on how we feel. We all thought that our lost and found board, that we had like a 9% return owner rate. It wasn't getting animals back at the amount of time it took to maintain that board and move them each day. Or I think we changed the heading of what day that they were reported lost. So online reporting, getting letters sent out immediately, the timely calling on any phone numbers and all of that. We put process. That's what actually gets animals back home, not the feel good hanging it on a board. Again, and if people came to the shelter, they were going to come and walk through the shelter to look anyway. So the board wasn't what made that reuniting for the most part. And on occasion, you'll hear the anecdotal stories. Somebody will see the board, say, I think I know that dog. And Dallas has 1.3 million people. That didn't happen a lot. When it did, it sure as heck made the news, and even we publicized it and we're happy about it. But at the volume we were at, we couldn't wait on hopes that somebody comes in and looks at a board.
Right. So if there's a shelter, they are struggling to get funded at the level they want. So the main advice is, and I'm saying this but I want you to say no, Mandy, or yes, Mandy, even if they don't have the data at that point, they need to start saying, we're putting the pin in the ground right now. Like, we are going to start tracking this data. And really, they need to look at, like you said, medical. Let's say that they really want to bring on a shelter veterinarian, then they really need to start and go back and look at what are the medical cases that have been happening in the shelter, and what is the financial impact of having them for a long time in the shelter? Is there any data on reduction of animals at large due to spay and neuter services? Like, all of that kind of builds out the story that they will be sharing with leadership. Is that correct?
That is correct. And even if they haven't been keeping tremendous data, you can get the data based on your intake, what your budget was, and what it costs per day or per animal, what the spending has equal. And the good thing is there are a lot of cities now that are doing that, so you can at least compare it. That, hey, look, we're 75% less than a peer city. That's an easy enough number. If your budget's 5 million and you've got X amount of animals that come in, how much is your cost per care? And then you can look into the what are the positive outcomes and the other positive things and negative things that are happening, and say, this, we're paying this to kill this many animals, and there's not a lot of elected officials that will raise their hand and say, we want to kill a bunch of animals. I haven't found many that will want to raise their hand and say that. Everyone's got limits, and there are resources. We can't just give you everything, and we still have a lot of other departments that's fair, and I can deal with that. But to be able to have the opportunity to have the discussion, we're spending this much per animal, and that counts the officer and everybody who ends up touching that animal. That all just gets thrown into one pot. I think that's a starting point, at least understand. And again, if they're happy with the results they're getting already, then great. I mean, who doesn't want more in their budget? But I think there's very few that don't know what they could do more if they had more of whatever. Breaking down by division, at least how we're set up, that was a little harder for us to do. Again, being a brand new department, we didn't have anything to compare to. So many things overlap. Shelter and medical overlap like crazy. Our field services overlap like crazy. Admin overlaps with everybody on everything that they do. Shelter actually took the money for the fee or whatever, and then admin processed it. But we've done a really good job breaking that down, which has put us in this period of knowing what every single position. You want to take this one temporary kennel cleaner, this is the production that one person in this position gets. But I do think at least starting big, you can at least have a better understanding, and then try to look to other municipalities that are similar in size and look at the results that they're getting. That's at least something you can start to build a discussion with. Everyone's not going to have private money paid for the Boston consulting firm to come in and count loose dogs and outcomes and all that. I understand that's not a reality, that everyone is going to have that to get to a real starting point. But there's things that are being counted now that at least can push the discussion. And everybody's counting intake right now. So I think use that for a positive. This is whatever your number is, whether it's 3,000 or 30,000, it can at least speak to the scope of everything else that's built around it. It gets to another level. The medical, again, is huge, and we really, really started there. And I could relate it because in Cleveland, we didn't have an in-house vet. As we ramped up adoptions, we couldn't get them fixed in time. So sometimes animals were staying almost 2 weeks waiting to get fixed to be able to leave. Everybody can understand that and that pain. We've all seen that. Like, oh my goodness, this dog would leave today or tomorrow if he could get fixed tomorrow, but we just can't because we're so backed up on it. So we really did try to solve for that, and that's an easy enough number to come up with. Also, that if it's from the day the animal was adopted to when it actually left the building. And I think that most logical policymakers, if you're able to get to that number, and it is medical money that you're trying to get. Look, dogs still have a 4-day length of stay after they're adopted, waiting to get fixed until they can get X, Y, and Z done before they can leave. Usually because of either state or city ordinances are why they can't leave.
Right.
So it's basically an unfunded mandate when that happens, that you don't have the ability to, the animal needs X, Y, or Z to leave, and should be able to happen the second it's off a hold is when it should be able to get those, in most places the animal has to be fixed before it leaves. And then if you can't, in Cleveland, I had to loosen things up and let animals go and then come back. And that was tough to trudge through that. People, what if they don't? And it wasn't. The vast majority came back. On occasion, we were trying to chase somebody down. It was still better than me killing animals because I ran out of cages. For the anecdotal person who didn't come back for their appointment, that yes, you can take this animal home, but he's got to come back on Friday to get fixed. Again, if you start to record it, they're going to see that it happens way less than we would like to think, that the stories would tell us that, oh, it happens like crazy and they're just out there breeding like crazy. Put a microchip in it, put vaccines, put all that other stuff in it that you can if you're waiting on it being altered. And there's still options then. If it's 10% don't come back, you're going to see an increase in live release rate right off the bat. The animal's now got your microchip in it, so you have a chance to track it down. It's what government lawyers are for. Make sure that the contract is solid, that you have some right to go and get the animal if it gets to that. But they'll see they're not spending a lot of time chasing down if that's really an issue. But as a good selling point to the powers that be, you got a 4-day length of stay after the animal's spoken for. That's ridiculous.
Yeah.
I won't need
Okay,
as
so
much shelter if I can get these animals out faster. It'll actually save you money in the long run.
I love that because it falls into why we started this podcast. Just you talking about how you have a high compliance of people who do post spay and neuter, because we have had to do that because of COVID. We have had to limit our veterinary access, and we have seen the same thing. And I do think that a lot of the story of animal welfare has been dictated by emotional individuals who have kind of shared a story and a false reality that the majority of people in our country are bad. And they're not. I mean, most people, I think, are responsible. They want to do the right thing. They may not have access. And by us being focused on providing access, bridging that gap, we see really amazing outcomes when we trust our community to do the right thing.
Yeah, and I think we've been on some calls together here of late on that, and it is that much more prevalent how many people hold feelings like that. And again, and I can speak very clearly on Dallas. I don't know if you were on the one that I ended up sharing the map of Dallas, and then the pet stores, and there was one pet store south of Interstate 30. So 750,000 people with one pet store. And I'm friends with PetSmart and Petco, and I talked, look, we need more. Our highest producing offsite adoption event is the one PetSmart south of Interstate 30. It's our highest producing. We could take 30 dogs there tomorrow, and all 30 dogs would get adopted from there. Our highest adoption areas are in areas that don't have access to vet care. And so are we supposed to exclude that population? They're going to get an animal to begin with. So you're feeding the cycle. You say you don't want backyard breeding and all of that. So by becoming that resource, you start to build that trust that we started this conversation with the community that actually needs you the most. And it frees up other resources when you stop fighting it. So many agencies will fight that area so bad that and I'm sorry, I can say this as a Black man, that this idea, this notion that we're going to take animals from poor neighborhoods and adopt them out to rich neighborhoods, it is beyond racist at its core. It's beyond discrimination at its absolute core. Again, person is a dog fighter, person is a breeder. I'm with you. We're not placing to those also. But again, when you actually have data, we do the dead animal pickup in Dallas. We're not finding these animals dumped all over the place. There can always be an anecdotal thing, and that is absolutely horrible when that does happen. I want to say 0 of our adopted animals in the last 2 years have been at the center of an animal cruelty case in Dallas. I think it's 0. I'm almost positive. And if it's not 0, it might be 1 or 2. And even with that, that's horrible. But we've handled almost 80,000 animals in 2 years. So when you're actually looking at numbers as opposed to a horrible thing that happened, again, and as a municipality, to say no, it's only a matter of time till you're going to get sued and lose horribly on a discrimination suit. You absolutely. So why would you not want to become the resource? Many of these animals have not ever been to a vet to begin with, and you're their first experience getting them vet care and can explain. We developed a partnership with VCA hospitals. It's also every adopted animal gets a packet and gets $300 worth of visit at VCA to develop that type of relationship. And if you're really trying to find answers as opposed to sticking your head in the sand and we're going to rob from the poor and give to the rich, the reverse Robin Hood, it's not realistic. You're missing out on a huge population of your public that wants to be on your side, but not if they don't trust you and that all you're there is doing is to write them tickets or that they're not good enough to adopt from you. It's as a person of color, that hits me really, really close to home, is I think 80% of the poverty in Dallas are people of color. So that people won't say it out loud. I usually talk them through that. Say this all the way out. You're not going to adopt the poor people of color. Say it out loud. And not many people will let it get to that point where they'll say that out loud, but that is what they're doing when they have practices like that.
Yeah, I love it. I want to like reach through and be like, yes, because we're on absolutely the same page. I love hearing you say it. I think I emailed you after that saying that I just appreciated how authentic you were, and acknowledging that you may have been doing the same thing without realizing it. And I think that each of us have the opportunity to have this awakening moment. And what I keep thinking in my head is that all these years we've really been fighting against something, right? Like we're saving lives, but we were constantly fighting against something. Rather than now, I feel like the shift is that we're finally collectively trying to fight for something. And we're actually fighting for animals, and not to, save them from bad people, but to say, we want to support our community in loving and caring for their pets, not good versus bad. We're all together, we're all equal. I think shelters sometimes take a position of authority and we're somehow better than everybody else. And if we can just simply break it down to one thought, that we are our community and they are us, like there's literally no difference other than we have the job and they don't. If we can do that, we would be in a great world. And I do think that animal welfare being as prevalent as it is in this country, this is my Mandy Pollyanna moment, that there are so many people that interact with shelters. We have an amazing opportunity to change the conversation and to show the world what it means to be positive, to be optimistic, and to help people in a different way. And we need that change right now. So I'm glad that we have such a wonderful leader in Dallas helping change this conversation.
Oh, no, thank you. It's a grind. You have to be able to adjust and pivot very, very quickly. But until we start being a more inclusive industry, the cap is kind of on as much as the industry is going to grow. And I think that some people have seen that in the last couple of months here and some of the things that have happened across the country. And there are some that are fighting very hard to hold on to that. They're also the same ones that you said it perfectly, had to be against something. It was against the shelters. The shelters are all horrible. So Jim Tedford just repeated a quote the other week, and it wasn't his quote, but it was, blaming the shelter for euthanasia is like blaming the American Cancer Society for cancer. No, it's a product and they're trying to deal with it. Well, most shelters are working really, really hard these days and trying, and so there's still the hold ons. It doesn't matter. You're in charge of a shelter, so you must be horrible. But this next iteration is truly embracing the community. It's why Dallas is now a tier 1 shelter of Haas, the Haas project. And we're not going to not do our jobs. My mandate hasn't changed on loose dogs, that we still need to find a way to secure them. But we think that a lot of our, the reach that we were doing with the focus on engaging with the community to find that owner fit in perfectly with what Haas is all about. And again, and that's going to look different in every single community as to the different elements on how they're put together. But it's going to take the community to ultimately solve the problem. We see it coming from the north, and we had a lot of dogs in Cleveland, not like we have in Texas. Transport has its role. My hope is that in however many years transport isn't seen as it is right now. It truly is a lifeline to relieve pressure, to get animals in the areas that don't have it. I hope that way as a country we're looking at, there's not enough animals to get pets in everybody's home. And then we can have that discussion. Just don't leave us behind that are still out there grinding away. But again, that map of our highest adoption areas, and that's with no pet store, not us doing targeted adoption events in that area, is one of the most underserved areas in the city. It's in the same area that Antoinette Brown was mauled to death in Southeast Dallas. They found a way to get to our shelter, to come and follow our process and to adopt an animal. That's when you actually look at the number, it makes you go, wow, let's stop believing, like you said, the Pollyanna feel good. And what's really happened, they really want a pet. They're willing to come to the shelter. And we feel really good with the information that we're giving and the access to resource and what you do if X, Y, or Z happens. And again, assuming that money alone makes you a good pet owner, that is just so misguided. I've seen tons of neglected animals from people that make way more money than that Jamison will ever make. So putting that the money alone is a component. The data doesn't show that.
Yeah. And there's just so much data to support the human-animal bond and the benefits. And I feel like people who are marginalized and underserved have an immense amount of stress happening in their lives. And it is a complete issue to me to say, oh, you know what, though, you're too poor to have the comfort in your life of a pet. So I really appreciate the work you're doing. And thank you so much for taking the time. I'm just in closing, wanted to know if there's any books, podcasts, anything that you've been listening to that you feel support the work and what you're doing. Also, just want to clarify with everybody that HAAS is the Human Animal Social Support Project that is being led by America Pets Alive, and you can find out more information by visiting, they just started a Facebook page that you just put in Human Animal Support Services. And if you go to the America Pets Alive website, they have a page just on that group, and there are a lot of working groups that people can join. I just had a call this morning, and there's like 250 different people that are involved in this group nationally, which means that shelters throughout the country are all jumping on board to be a part of this and a part of the working group to see what we've been talking about today come to fruition. So outside of my little commercial for HAAS, do you have any podcasts, any information you'd like to share?
I think some of the nationals are pushing out really, really good things. I'm a little biased. I'm a part of a couple of them, but NACA, I'm on that board, and we've really, really been pushing in with COVID, and have really become for animal services a main point that people can go for information. And yes, field services is the main topic, but we also totally realize the interconnection with shelter and medical and everything. So NACA, we've been pushing really hard to push things out. AWA, so much respect for the people of AWA. COVID, if anything can stick positively out of COVID, it's that everybody started playing nice together. For once, everybody had the same thing. It wasn't just a hurricane in this region of the country. Everybody was dealing with it. And I was so happy to see all of these groups that normally wouldn't talk to each other have joined up. And a lot of those calls and weekly meetings are still happening with leaders, AMPA, ASPCA, the large national funders. And so to answer your question, I did a great job of not answering. Nothing specific other than any of those national groups. I think everybody is putting out and resharing when another group comes out with a good podcast. Who did I just see Dr. Fisher talk with? Was that I think that might have been AWA.
AWA, yeah.
North Carolina is just amazing. And everyone is really trying to put relevant information out. And I think the days of who needs to get credit for it, hopefully that's ending, because that's been a big problem in this industry is people trying to get credit. We all benefit when animal welfare is benefiting. We all benefit when our communities and the bond with their animals is helping to be kept in place. And I think everybody is seeing that from COVID now. And that's my hope, that if COVID's ever really gone someday, I don't know that it's going to be, certainly not in Texas here, but hopefully when that happens, we don't just revert back to some of the things that we thought were okay and thought good. It's involving the community as a whole is going to be this ultimate answer to get us out of any pet overpopulations anywhere in the country. Then we can look to the next latest and greatest animal thing we're going to take on.
I think that the one benefit, and again, I don't want to downplay COVID because it's really bad, but there's been two, this social experiment, I guess, of what's happened with COVID and Black Lives Matter has really brought about some really wonderful change that we've needed for a while. So those are good aspects of it. But I also think with COVID, it's going to last long enough that we will see systemic change, because we won't, by the time it's done, we won't even remember how we used to do it. That's my hope.
I agree with you. I'll jump on that. I'll jump on that train with you. I agree with you.
All right, Ed. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today. And I'm sure that if anybody needs resources or assistance, they can reach out to you. NACA definitely has some great resources on the subjects we were talking about today. So thank you again for taking the time.
Anytime. Thanks for having me.